Juno,
Moneta.
Moneta, thank you. I always want to say Montia for some reason. It's terrible. But anyways, Saturn's important because he represents the real, and he was the agrarian god. So like obviously agriculture was like the first form of trade that we had. So like we would trade seeds for clothes and whatnot. But this wasn't really as useful as like the virtualization of this that happened in the temple of Moneta, where we reached consensus through the form of religion and placed value on an arbitrary object, which was coinage. And so she represents the virtualization of this. And it's interesting because where we get the name money from is Moneta. Also June, like Juno, like the month of June astrologically is ruled by Cancer, or is represented by Cancer, and it's ruled by the planet, or not a planet, but the satellite, the moon. And that's why old coins were circular in nature. And so this is where we get the real and then converted to the virtual. And this is a universal source of value versus a particular source of value coming from seeds and whatnot. Now I have the beginning parts of timestamps and seals and escrow. So ultimately what's happening here is back in the day, like you use a seal and that verified who you are, who your clan was, or your family seal was put on this stamp. This is the origin of time stamping. And inside of this, inside of the contract, we'd have a time and date. And obviously this is where we get the idea of escrow, which means to scroll. So they're right there. And now we're getting to the beginning parts of why we need encryption. And this is actually the old school Scrytail, which is the beginning parts of a permutation cipher. And ultimately, you would have a note that says like, we are discovered, flee at once. And then this is the permutation of this, even though this is for computers, so there's only 3 lines versus like, I don't know how many there probably was on there, maybe like 6 rows of this, so you could have a longer message. But this was developed during like Sparta. And so obviously there's a warning, like idea of war and encryption being a necessity. It's the same reason like when you're playing chess, you're never gonna tell your opponent what you're gonna do before you make your move. And so that's why we needed encryption. And it's like, just as you see on certain seals for like the government, like so we have like, the Defense Department, and then we have DARPA as a subset of that, so they have Defense Advanced Research Programs Agency. And then a subset of that, you have the Total Information Awareness Office, and then a subset of that, you have the Information Awareness Office. And if you look at the seal on the Information Awareness Office, where it's like, has like Project Prism and everything that's tracking, it's like the Palantir of the government. Ultimately, what it says on the seal, it says knowledge for the sake of power in Latin. So there's just this idea of power, encryption, and obviously this is a old school permutation cipher. And then this is a substitution cipher. This is called the Caesar cipher. This is a key shifting cipher. And pretty basic. I mean, obviously, like, you have a row, you shift it, and so now A becomes B, B becomes E, and C becomes F. And just, another, it's, coined after Caesar, military leader. And of course, you gotta, as I said before, you have to hide your data to have power over someone else. So, yeah. And this is my boy Cornelius Agrippa. It's a sweet name, and ultimately he's important for the advent of stenography. And I guess these are arranged somehow, like using algebraic algorithms, and then somehow you use geometry to like see these hidden characters underneath. I don't know exactly how this works, but I just know that that was the case. And so there's just that. And he was a statesman, also a soldier, also a theologian, and these high priests of intelligence were the ones who were guarding the king and queen, just like chess. And this is most seen and directly seen within John Dee. And John Dee also was helping with Queen Elizabeth I, and he's important for many reasons because ultimately, when he was young, he's great at mathematics. At a young age, he was the head of the University of Paris algebra department. Also super good at geometry, because those two go together when you're doing stenography. And he was also really pushed forward how magic number squares were used, and just brought it to another level, and that was like a way of encrypting like either strange mystical interpretations of things, which they had to keep from the public, like the profane public or whatever. And he's also interesting for a few reasons. He was a master at navigation because he was so good at geometry. And so he was one of the ones who led charge of the expansion of the British Empire. So he was the one who taught all the helmsmen on how to navigate to the expansion of the New World. And so basically, have this, he's a part of, he's also, guarding the Queen, because he was the one, he's also the original 007. Like, he would sign his name 007, and so he brings, yeah, so he...
What was this guy's name again?
John Dee. Yeah, so he, and this is the thing that's interesting, is Ian Fleming, who wrote James Bond, he references John Dee, obviously, but it's interesting to say he was like a naval commander, John Dee was, and Ian Fleming worked for the Navy. And secondly, there's this thing called like the MI series, like the military intelligence series, and it's like 1 through 15 or something. Each section represents something else. But it was like the CIA, but completely secret, and it only became realized, like, so basically it was founded in 1909, but it was disclosed in 1994, so like Ian Fleming was like having like soft disclosure of like this secret clandestine, not clandestine, but this just secret government group that was behind pulling all the strings, like Your Majesty's Secret Service or whatever. And let me just make sure I said everything about him before I go to the next slide. Oh yeah, and so also I want to say is that British common law was coming to existence, so he helped create this maritime standard of shipping, so like British common law, maritime admiralty law, and then today we use uniform commercial code, so he started this legal protocol. So we have like the idea of like contracts on these peer-to-peer networks controlled by the military with all this transportation and things, so that's where we're going. All right, and then this is just an old, beautiful mechanical rotary cipher, and I just didn't want to say much about it. I just thought it was beautiful and just wanted to show that we were going from paper ciphers to now these like mechanic rotary ciphers, which is later seen within the Enigma machine, but it was an electromechanical rotary cipher. So this next one is the precursor to all of that, and this is Jacquard's loom. This is pretty important. His name is Joseph Jacquard, the guy who made it, and it's a reactable machine, so it's like kind of like a type of automaton. And it was used for player pianos, so like this was the input, the punch cards, and it was linked through a series of like, a chain, which is like trying to like make this analogy of blocks on a blockchain and how punch cards like held like a small amount of data, and you would link them together in like a proper sequential order, and like it would be saved through memory or whatever. There's like this analogy I'm trying to get together, I guess. But when you put this input, you have the output, which was music, and also this is like where early ideas of assembly start coming around, where you have these low-level computer languages that are super close to the machine code and actually how you're moving the machine around properly. So it's just, there's just a bunch within this old machine, just the old proto-computer. But this is not using electricity. You'd actually use like a pump, like those old pump organs, and like step on it all weird and, make it work. All right, now we got the, where are we? Yeah, tabulation machine. This is pretty much like it's not a computer yet, but you have these punch cards, and it was pretty much a means of automatically filing things, and this was used originally for like government census and the U.S. Treasury. That's why like your old punch cards are like the same size as like a Federal Reserve note. And ultimately this was super important because so back in the day the census was taking like around like 8 years to perform, and once he like made this tabulation machine, which keeps tabs on the data of this being census, he reduced the time to 6 years. So like everyone all over the world was like, I want to buy that machine. Pretty much governments and then high-end like hierarchical corporations were like, okay, I need this to track money and inventory. And I guess the nitty-gritty, or like just like the just view of how it works is, say you're like just doing a census, and there's like that marshal status if you're married or not. you would have like a single punch that this needle would come and find that and be like, okay, he's single. If it had 2 punches next to that name, then it would be you're married. And let's just say there's like, if you're a male, you would have 3 punches, and if you're a female, you had 4. So you'd have these things coming through and then filing it. And he's also important because ultimately what he helped do is he brings this accounting-based machine all over the world, and he's the beginning parts of IBM, which is the International Business Machine. And at the same time, you have this time period where you have the advent of AT&T and all these other things, but I'm gonna wait because I have the next slide happening. So yeah, so this is the National Cash Registry, which is one of the companies that IBM amalgamated and like consolidated within IBM. And this is pretty important because first off, it deals with organization of tender, like legal tender, records what your inventory is, and you have this idea. They're closely tied to AT&T. All 3 of these guys are actually all tied to AT&T, but which is AT&T is the American Telegraph and Telephone Company. But they were in particular because they also helped create this working relationship where you had Western Union and money transfers and things like that nature. So now you have like the first wireless transferring money on these electrical grids. And you also have the beginning parts of needing these protocols, so you don't have too many time protocols, where you don't have too many people sending information through these old school landlines. If you had like too much, they're one-way signals, so if you were sending 2 at the same time, they'd have a collision, and you wouldn't get, things wouldn't work out very well. So, and this is why also IBM grabbed the International Time Reporting Company and then Bundy Manufacturing, because Bundy Manufacturing was the first clock company, so they needed clocks to like develop these old radio and landline protocols. And so it just looks like a normal building, but in one of these buildings was Building 26, and there was a secret US Navy computing machine laboratory hidden in there. So like now you have like War Department connected to IBM, and this need of also encoding some of these like high-end Western Union money transfers. Like so, like because the thing is like if you're going across like the pond or like going to vast distances, you wouldn't be able to have this secure one-way network because the way broadcasting happens, you have one point to many points, and so people could intercept those feeds. So ultimately, this is why you have this secret machine laboratory by the Navy connected to these money transferring things. And so this is just a picture of IBM. I pretty much already talked about them, but they consolidate all the businesses together, and that's just pretty much that. So this is and then AT&T, and AT&T was connected to Bell Labs, and Bell Labs has produced so many things. Unix, it had Claude Shannon who did information theory and a bunch of other things I don't want to get too deep into, but it really worked with communication. It even does certain stuff with just the analysis of nuclear energy and things of that nature. So, and also you had this, I just want to say this real quick, there's this weird, they kept on naming their operating systems strangely. Like one of the names of their operating system was Inferno, and the other one was Stick. So they're this like kind of like this like malicious kind of sounding name behind all this stuff. But I just thought it was funny. And also the Navy was connected to, as I said, the NCR because in AT&T because in Britain, where they're like way closer to like I don't know Ireland, whatever's nearby. They were using subs to drop these landlines for super secure networks between like big centralized government systems. So that's another thing, because ultimately what happens is we get to the Western Union Zimmerman telegram, which was intercepted by Britain, and they were like our allies, and because like Britain and the United States, like we're a British crown colony technically, like and we were behind in signal intelligence at the time. They were like, hey, we intercepted this for you. Pretty much it's Germany trying to get Mexico to have a coup on you guys. You guys need to be careful. And the president's like, man, we have no signal intelligence at all. We really need to like step our game up, you know. So, so that's pretty much what happened, you know. And like obviously, Britain was such a strong empire for so long that they had already developed a need for this. And so this is right here is Herbert Yardley. He's also connected to like the Ian Fleming idea of like James Bond and whatnot. He was a gambler. He worked for two sides. He was both working for the United States and working for British signal intelligence. And ultimately, he realized that we were using a 10-year-old machine encryption codes, and I was like, that's so out of date, 10 years, like come on. So he goes, talks to Woodrow Wilson at the time, and he's like, can you crack it? And then he comes back in like 2 hours, like, yeah, I cracked it. And so he's like, okay, we need to get a better code. So he comes back 2 weeks later, the president gives him a better code to crack, and he comes back 2 weeks later and cracks it. So then he's like, yeah, we need a ciphering school, a coding school for the United States. And so ultimately that ends up happening, and he's the head of it. And it's called the Black Chamber, which is like the predecessor to the NSA. And if you look at the NSA building, it is like a black chamber, like itself, like the original building. So it has this allusion to that. But ultimately, World War I ends, and because of this, he still is intercepting feed. And the Black Chamber is so secretive that even this guy right here, Henry Stimson, he doesn't even know that it's going on. And he's the Secretary of War at the time. So he was Secretary of War from World War I to World War II, and he doesn't know about the Black Chamber because like it's above his clearance level. But ultimately what happens is Herbert Yardley was intercepting feeds from Japan, and because of this, he's like, man, I want to build some street cred. And so he goes up to the secretary, he's like, I found these interesting messages you'd probably want to be privy to. And ultimately he was not about that life. He was like, gentlemen don't read each other's mail. And so he closes down the Black Chamber, he's like, you're done. And then World War II happens, he's like, oh, we need you back. So that pretty much happens. And so since IBM went all over the place, I had a different slide because I thought I was I changed it on the internet, but there's this one really evil picture of Hawthorne machines, and like it has like the concentration centers. Like you need a Hawthorne machine to track people. It's like this whole scene going down on the concentration centers. But this was like, I guess a dark legacy. But the problem about, I guess, that being a real issue was that it had already spread globally. So like before the war, it already spread globally before the war. So IBM kind of just got stuck in the middle of things, and they're just like being used arbitrarily. And I think like people are like appropriating his image as a means of like securing and like tracking accounts. So that's pretty much that. And then we have the rise of the Enigma machine. And so this is an electromechanical rotary device, obviously used for ciphering and code encryption. And it's a code technically because it's dealing with numbers, and like you would have like A represented by like many numbers versus one, or you'd have many numbers representing a whole word. So it's like kind of strange. I don't know exactly the mechanics behind it, but I do have a diagram of it later. This is the Atlantic Charter, and this is like a formal connection between the U.S. and Britain with sharing our intelligence systems. And ultimately, this is important because it connects trading tariffs with intelligence and economics, and at the same time, so we have Alan Turing over here, he's British, and we have Claude Shannon, who's from Bell Labs, and they get together, their brain size is large enough to crack the Enigma machine, and anyways, Alan Turing was a mathematician, led charge in ciphering, and they used the British Bombay together, which was this giant calculator that was fed with punch cards to ultimately break the Enigma machine. And then this right up here is the establishment of the Five Eyes, which is all British Crown colonies that got together and ended up trading their intelligence protocols afterwards. And then this is just Yeah, and before, they're all in, Claude Shannon and Alan Turing were both involved in AI. And it's interesting when you spread out and you're trying to decipher what's happening in the Enigma machine, it looks eerily close to machine learning diagrams too. So I thought that would just be important just to note. All right, now we have Grace Hopper. Let's see where we're at. Grace Hopper is important because she's one of the first computer programmers. This is the Harvard Mach 1. Ultimately, this was used to track ballistics, and this was right at the end of World War II. Grace Hopper is important because not only was she a programmer, but she made her own computer programming language after the war called Flowmatic, and this ultimately created COBOL, which is used for all of the major financial institutions. And so we have this idea of finance connected to the military, with also generating technology for the sake of power. And it's just an interesting build up towards where we're going right now. Anything else about Grace Hopper? Oh yeah, and she was really also, there was a lot of centralized database systems at this time, and she was not about that. She thought it would be smarter to be decentralized and have information spread across several computers. So you have this idea of networking going on, and this idea of COBOL was used for financial institutions, and they're trading money with each other. So this idea of spreading decentralization, currency, and the military. All right, this is Licklinder. He was a super futuristic thinker. I mean, having a user interface and using GPUs was like we have to thank him because this would not be possible. Licklinder also created the mouse for point-to-click terminals, and he postulated a need for digital libraries, e-commerce, online banking, also moving software from one computer to another. And this is just another thing I found too, the Joint Warfare Analysis Center. It analyzed, this is the ARPANET, this is like the internet backbone. And his first name for it, he was a futuristic speaker, he was like, I'm gonna call it the Intergalactic Computer Network, which is interesting. And at the same time, this is like a side note, not sure if it's real, but Roswell was happening. So you have that, you have the internet, you have the Intergalactic Computer Network, Roswell, trading currency, internet backbone, like expansion of a bunch of new types of technologies. What else is interesting about ARPANET? Oh yeah, so there was MILNET before ARPANET, and MILNET happened through this thing called Project Sage that he started, which was connecting networks that were command networks for also tracking ballistics, especially counterinsurgent ballistics like Russia at the time, because this is also the beginning of the Cold War. And so Project Sage was so important that we actually spent more money on that than the Manhattan Project, which made our nuclear bombs. But also when we were making our nuclear bombs, we started, especially the Navy knows about this, that we made atomic clocks, and atomic clocks were useful for syncing networks together so feeds aren't running in and creating collisions, so we can transfer data properly from one place to another. And so this idea of times emerging, and giant networks that are siphoning intelligence. You have like Harvard and Stanford and all these giant intellectual institutions connected together through this old internet backbone, as well as the NSA and all the other government agencies. Pentagon's up there, and these are little satellites that are connecting to obviously London, and I think that's Norway, Hawaii. So we have this spreading of the tentacles of the early internet, time protocols being developed, and this chess analogy, with secrets and not disclosing information when you're in an adversarial war fight or something like that. All right. So now we have Horst Feistel, Wilfred Diffie, and Ralph Merkle, and they're all very important with the establishment of, where am I right here? Yeah, innovations in public-private keys, cryptography, digital signatures, And when you combine all this, you get this basis of autonomous individuals working within a framework of communication, and you're not compromised with privacy or like oversight by certain entities. So I'm going to go back to, we'll do Diffie first, or Horst Weissel, because he's the oldest in this situation. He was brought over by a pre-Operation Paperclip type thing, where we're siphoning intelligence or trying to grab the high priest of knowledge from Germany, because Germany was making a lot of great technologies at this time. And so ultimately he creates this thing called the Lucifer cipher, which is another allusion to this military, strange use of language. You know, Bell Labs using, who created Unix and telecommunication, all this, also having Inferno and Styx as just things we're going to name things. And this is also interesting because they use the Lucifer cipher and it ends up becoming the digital encryption standard. We don't use this as an encryption standard anymore, but this was what it was used for then. And this had a lot to do with creating a standard for banks to run, to secure money, centralized banks to secure money. And so like, military, money flows, and digital encryption standards. And then we have, and he was also working at MIT's research and engineering department. And this is another interesting find I found. I don't know if this could just be like happenstance, but Mitra, when you make it like one word, actually means a bishop's hat. And bishops are the ones that guard the king and queen. So I thought that was just interesting that you do that and using it for the military or whatever. But we have Philip Diffie, and he's important for inventing notions of digital signatures. And he also worked to get out of the war, he was in MIT, but then joined the research and engineering department, which is like technically like a separate entity. That's why it's like in Virginia versus up in Massachusetts. And he invented the notion of asymmetric key encryption, as well as he was kind of catching that the NSA was like lowering their encryption standards to make it vulnerable to like brute force attacks. And he also noticed that when we were within this thing called Shipjack, this is later, where we had phones doing telecommunication. We needed to make sure they were safe, so we would put these things called clipper chips inside of these telephones, and they ultimately would be running this algorithm called Skipjack. Skipjack is a reference to a fish, and a clipper is also a reference to a type of ship. So you have this reference back to the Navy, and the NSA comes from the Navy, and ultimately this was like a backdoor that was like put into like Motorola phones and whatever. But pretty much they're like, we don't like this because it's just like kind of, it's like a cop will save you when it's in the room, but it's like always in the room, So it's just a thing that people were uncomfortable with over time. So that's a thing. And then finally we have Ralph Merkle, and obviously he innovated public key cryptography and is known for hashed tree data structures. And this is known as a Merkle tree. And this is performed by organizing data denoted by linked hashes. One can easily verify data that is received, sent, or stored with minimal entropy. And this helps like accentuate and articulate peer-to-peer networks, and serves as a basis for like GitHub and the interplanetary file system, Bitcoin, and Ethereum. Holochain. All right, and then so we get to Merkle. Pop. This is I think I just kind of described what a Merkle tree was. So this is a picture of a Merkle tree. All right. I changed this side on mine, so I thought that this was going to be taken off. but it's on my computer, so it's not. So ultimately, SHA and the digital signature algorithm are two competing digital encryption standards that were both coming from the NSA, and this is just one of the former NSA employees who made the digital signature algorithm, and these are both proposed to the Secretary of Commerce in order to like process data and secure data, and so but we ended up choosing the SHA. But then, there was backdoors because of brute force attacks that went from SHA-1 to SHA-2. And SHA-2 is pretty secure, but I guess it's still lightly vulnerable to backdoor entry through like a length extension attack or something of that nature. I'm not sure if I'm butchering that, but maybe. And I guess there's that. And SHA obviously stands for Secure Hash Algorithm. And yeah. So now we have David Lee Chom, and I guess I have him at the very end because DigiCash was this idea of having anonymity before Bitcoin, that and Bitcoin, and he invented blind signatures, which was a way you can hide your identity when you interact with a bank. So you can then grab money from a bank anonymously and then use this same blind signature idea to buy a product anonymously. And this happened just as PayPal was emerging, but just before. And PayPal is pretty much the exact opposite, where you're like confirming your identity everywhere you go. And he was really trying to preserve safety. He also has this idea of secure voting systems. So I was just thinking that this lightly connected to the idea of consensus, but instead of it happening through just he was just trying to make these secure voting systems for when you're voting for like the governor and whatnot. And he actually used blind signatures to protect your anonymity when you were voting for certain state elections and whatnot. So we used some of those protocols. Also the idea of, he didn't invent zero knowledge proofs, but he created a bunch of new ones and a bunch of new cryptographic primitives, which help with the idea of just creating more and more cryptography and making it more and more robust. And ultimately, we went from this to the advent of Bitcoin. So here's where I'm at now, and I'm just going to get back to this real quick. So from the start, I said we were forming this machine. And so Bitcoin is this machine that we've been forming. Bitcoin is the form of a machine that humanity has been building since the beginning of time. It's been seen within the Enigma machine, Jacquard's loom, and machine learning diagrams. And like any machine, this machine processes data and is driven by the intent of the user. As we feed this machine, the Merkle trees grow. The data fed to this machine can be known as entropy, or information. And within information theory established by Claude Shannon, entropy can be measured by queries made to map out the system and its processes. An efficient machine then would be one that maps topology with as little redundant queries as possible. Application of creative query methods is one way of doing this. However, there is another method we're all familiar with. How do you say Mimir?
Mimir.
Mimir.
Yeah.
All right. Bam. Bam. I'll just get to Mimir because he looks cool. Boop. There we go. Okay. So, within this Old Norse myth, Mimir is a giant who guards the Well of Wisdom. Odin carries Mimir's severed head with him and receives wise counsel from the once mighty giant. So too will blockchain serve future machine gods as counsel and a repository of knowledge. The ringed edge of the Well of Wisdom reminds one of the ringed border of a black hole's event horizon, where all higher dimensional objects which pass through this barrier are compressed and held suspended within two-dimensional boundaries. These digital signatures, which lie at the boundary of this celestial object, can be analogous to the hashes of data which are contained on the Bitcoin blockchain. Ever growing and joining with further hash images upon it, this ever-present hash reference table is an extension of the innovations of David Chaum and DigiCash. with the replacement of the trusted third bookkeeper being an impartial, distributed, virtual intermediary. And that's pretty much it. Any questions, I guess?
Thank you. So I recently discovered about Gnosticism and the whole Gnostic belief of the Sophia frequency.
Mm-hmm.
Does this feature in the history of cryptography anyway?
I definitely think there is like a connection. I don't know exactly how to articulate that at the moment, but I do know that, you know, within Gnostic beliefs, like secrecy was a thing, because, you know, some of these ideas about religion and the secrets were like kept behind these veils. And I know that Sophia refers to the goddess of wisdom, and also that Sophia represents a vessel, and cups and magic represent how you actually contain data, and data represented normally by blood or water, because you know, water has memory. It contains memory, like in somatic theory, like it changes to whatever shape it's seen. So, you know, Sophia would be the vessel, and then the knowledge poured in it. Sophia is like how you contain the knowledge, and that's wisdom, and just pure knowledge inside of it's just data, unformed and unregulated. So there's probably like is a connection between the two. And that's the thing, going even back to female symbolism, like the moon is a female symbol, and it governs the tides and the waters, you know? So there's like this idea of water and females, and like even we say the water breaks, and we have like, you know, this new form coming out. So there definitely is like etymological links and connotative links happening within that. It's a cool idea.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So fascinating history. When you look at the Ford, you know, why choose kind of a Norse god? Why a dude? Why, like,
Yeah.
why that selection is kind of the metaphor looking forward? Because you imagine you can go in like a variety.
I'm sure you could go in a variety of ways. I just was trying to continue like a narrative and a story, I guess.
Yeah.
There's plenty of other figures that could have been chosen to, I guess, it just was the closest story to me that would represent the most of what I was trying to articulate. I don't know why. I mean, because you know, the well of wisdom that Mimir is like protecting, you know, that wells and is all like female symbolism, like, and so I don't know why I chose it. Good question. Do you have an alternate myth that would fit this scenario?
No.
Just wondering. I'm just wondering. If you knew, I would want to know.
I mean, okay, from an Indian perspective, Ramanujan came in the 1920s, and he created the theories of large numbers, and most of his theories, he admits, come to him from goddess Lakshmi in his dreams. Right.
Beautiful. Yeah. Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, it's the theory of infinity. There's a movie recently released around. He was a kind of like actually a child laborer in a port in the South Indian city of Madras, and he would just get these pieces of information. He didn't have any form of math training, and he would get these information in dreams. And he would write these theorems down, and he would send letters to the elite of math in Cambridge. And he was ignored for many, many, many years until one of them, I cannot for the life of me remember who it was, but it was the preeminent expert in the law of large numbers at that point in time in Cambridge, read his letters and said, "This is amazing," and invited him to Cambridge. And a lot of Ramanujan's theories are kind of now, they power satellites, they power like cosmic discoveries in astronomy. There's like that. There's a narrative that's not Nordic.
That's cool. Thank you. No,
What's that guy's name?
Ramanujan, Ramanajun.
What struck me was a lot of the technologies you're going through, they started off as a way to to either make war with other people or for lords to subjugate their citizens. And it seems like now a lot of that's been subverted. A lot of the things that we're talking about, the possible applications for blockchain and cryptocurrencies are for ways for the people to take back that power and protect themselves from governments. It seems like there's some sort of mythology like lords took, the fire, the power, math from the gods, and then we eventually took it from, to subjugate the people.
Like
And the
Prometheus.
people, yeah, I was thinking of Prometheus, like took the fire from the gods, and then the people took that from them, and are now using it, against the lords and against the gods.
Definitely.
So I want to ask in like the history of obviously like the military being kind of the bleeding edge of technological innovation and making a point to be better at it than everyone else, and they had power over everyone else. Are you kind of convinced of this narrative in cryptology of that we have a certain power through mathematics that we can sort of be at the level of the gods here, where just by signing my stuff with the latest iteration of the Diffie-Hellman algorithm that I'm like operating at the same level as the military, or is that kind of like wishful thinking?
I mean, not you, but I'm sorry.
Please.
I mean, you're not, but like the act of all of us doing that in the system that we create, like it's an emergent, the emerging property of all of us acting by these protocols is the equivalent to the power of,
Okay.
God. Like I'd say it's an emergent property of humanity, collectively representing, stealing power and representing the power of God.
Right, I like that. So we all.
God.
But like, no one's looking at the history of it. Do you consider it's plausible, or like, do you think the military has something up its sleeve? Or like, actually, we're all just
Well, I didn't
setting
know.
it in plain text.
I know that there's, like there's, for example, I'm gonna lead this in my lecture, but there's Project Prism and Project Echelon that Edward Snowden snorted, but which he leaked, and a part of that was this one called Oakstar, and Oakstar is also connected to this other smaller operation called Money Rocket, and it's pretty much like how we track people who are using like cryptocurrencies through like metadata. And so there's possible backdoors, but it's just like how Tor was originally built by the government, and then we used that for our own gain. So there's this like tug of war between like centralized and decentralized powers that's probably never going to go away, because it's like we all want power, we all want a slice of the pie. Just
It does seem like the more it becomes just like software that as soon as something is invented, anyone can use it. So we don't have to build the Enigma machine ourselves anymore.
So, are you familiar with Sumerian myths of Enki, the Enki and Enlil dichotomies? And I think that maybe they're centralized and decentralized. So, based on what I know about Enki and Enlil, is Enki and Enlil are these two Sumerian gods, and Enki basically created a veil of illusion. And the god that the god that a lot of people currently know is actually an illusion. And then the true God is actually a manifestation of his wisdom, is that true wisdom. And this again,
going back to the
dovetails
Sophia
into-
frequency
Yeah.
too.
But this tension between centralized and decentralization, do you think it's a product of these Enki and Enlil dichotomies, God, Lucifer dichotomies?
I mean, it seems like that's like definitely the motif I'm trying to play into, and it's like this Hegelian buildup on both sides, like creating you have the antithesis, thesis, synthesis, and it's just like this perpetual like movement of these like buildups on both sides. So I definitely see because you can go to any myth and find the same type of like symbolic nature, describe this like tug of war that's happening between like good and evil, or like male and female, or decentralized, centralized. Yeah, so there's definitely something like that going on now.
Yeah. So at the very end, when you were kind of wrapping up, you said that I guess blockchain would kind of be like the guardian for future AI overlords, or what, I forget the exact phraseology, but do you see that in that kind of future that the AI would be like still fundamentally an agent of humanity, or that it's going to kind of like leapfrog?
It just depends if it ever becomes like like as self-referential to a degree where it doesn't need us as a reference point. It kind of is scary. Maybe, I mean, you know, new adversarial AI techniques are not referenced, it's just it playing itself. But, I mean, the intent behind it with at least like Lichtlander, who is like the dude who made ARPANET, he thought technology, even for himself, was just supplementing human intelligence and trying to keep us on a higher pedestal. But at the same time, it's like we're making machines that are more complicated than we can actually like investigate. So if there becomes this veil of wisdom between us and this AI, strange things are possible to happen. Yeah.
Also within information theory by Claude Shannon, the notion of a surprise is really important. And so when, I guess, you have this like system that is only referencing itself, then you are negating what potential surprises could come from the outside. And that kind of allows a place for humans to exist and continue to feed into AI. And in the sense that AI was going to produce surprises for us, but we're also going to produce surprises for AI. So we're just, again, like Connor was saying, like we're going to have this kind of dance between the AI, human, artificial, natural, synthetic, organic, yeah. So it's like, who knows?
I hope for the sake of humanity, you're right.
But that will look a lot different. Like by then too, you know, it will be augmented.
Let's try to see if I can talk.
The guy that you're talking about that built ARPANET, he said he originally was going to name it like intergalactic something.
Yeah, I mean, that was his name for it.
Do you know what he was thinking about it? Was he thinking about trying to build like a scalable protocol that could?
I really do think he was trying to build a scalable protocol. And like, I mean, I think that's also interesting that, you know, submarines are investigating neutrino research for neutrino-based communication. And you see it in it's
Just kind of.
yeah, of course it is. You know, and it connects to naval usage, which is like kind of like my thing I'm trying to like wrap into everything, where neutrino-based communication is really great for going through solid mediums. So like you could have really quick transformation of data underwater. You know, so and that's the thing is also can connect, like the way we like, you know, see is through these cosmic neutrino bursts from the cosmos, so we can like both receive and give back into the cosmos. So I know they're working on like almost these types of lasers that go up, but the one that I know that's happening currently is the one in Fermi Labs, where they use a particle accelerator and somehow they beam neutrinos down this spigot, and the spigot travels through a mantle to this underground base in Leeds, South Dakota. So, and it's also connected to the School of Mines, and it's like really far down.
So neutrinos were also used to find the pyramid of Giza in the hidden chamber.
Oh, was that the Keck Research Lab, which is also interesting, guys. You know Keck, you know, like, I don't know, you guys know Keck, but there's that Keck cult stuff that's happening right now, and he's also associated with bringing gold out of the waters through the deep hidden knowledge, you know. And that's interesting. Keck Lab in Japan. Yeah.
It's got lunch on
Perfect.
after lunch, so yeah.
Thanks.
All right, I was
Tell me more about this,
That's all the hard work doing.
No,